turned out that I was able to get work. And then in a really fortuitous circumstance, one of the editors I worked for at DC Comics I was working was Archie Goodwin. I did several. Archie kind of fed me some small jobs, kept me alive. My page rate, I could pay for a little apartment in Brooklyn. And after about 6 months of doing this, I came to New York in August of 72. And around about March of 72 or thereabouts, a little earlier maybe, Archie told me we'd become friends by then. He had been given Detective Comics to edit. He was going to do a new backup feature in the back called Manhunter. And would I be interested in drawing it? I had done just, the one-off job here and there and here and there. And I'd had enough jobs to, pay my rent and get some food. But the idea of doing a regular feature was great. It was a bi-monthly 8-page feature, so it wasn't a lot of money. But things cost less back then. So I took the gig. And what that meant was I was 6 months into my professional career when I did that work. I still have many friends and fans who think Manhunter is the best stuff I ever did. And it might be.
It's a work that it's very remembered by.
It does. It has a long shelf life, much longer than either Archie or I expected. And the part about it that was significant for me was that when I started doing that 6 months into my career, I was one more young guy in comics and not at all well known within the industry. This is before fandom had become what it is now. So there was no question about being a big star in fandom. It wasn't that kind of an industry. But when I finished the stories, about a year later when we wrapped it up, Archie left DC and went to Warren. So we wrapped up the series. And when we did that, by the time that happened, a little after that, all the editors knew who I was. And finding work was not an issue after that. The Manhunter story strip really, it made my professional career. So I will always owe that to Archie and to Manhunter for making my professional career. The one thing I will say is that when we were wrapping that strip up, Archie and I were talking once, and both of us had the same idea, which is that maybe we should just retire from comic books now. I'm not sure it's ever going to get any better than this. Of course, neither one of us did, and it worked out pretty well. But I understood that. I've worked with a lot of really good writers, including my wife, and she will not be unhappy if I say this. But there was a quality of working with Archie, and we didn't work that many times together. That and Alien, a couple other things, that was about it. That we were just able to do good comics. There was some quality between us that I thought brought out the best in both of us on the work that we did.
I understand that the first work that you have drawn and written at the same time was Galactica. Am I right?
That's right.
It
was great. The first I written and drawn. The writer, Roger McKenzie, got off the book around at the end of issue 16, I think. And this is an example of nepotism at its finest. My girlfriend was the editor of the book at the time, Louise Simonson, or Louise Jones, as she was then. And she asked if I had any interest in writing the book. And I thought, well, sure. I had helped various writers I had worked with plot some of the stories. I'd worked with Archie on some of that, so I'd learned a great deal from Archie. I'd worked with him. I'm not saying I helped out much, but I had some experience at least talking about plots and trying to figure out stories. David Nicolini the same way. I think I helped David almost not at all. I probably mostly got in David's way, but I did learn a lot from him. And Roger and I talked about the Galactica plots a lot. I learned more there. So I thought, sure, I'll take a crack at writing. The great thing about Galactica was it wasn't doing very well. So if the book sank, nobody would blame me because they would say, oh, well, it was going down anyway. And if the book did well, they'd say, wow, that's Simonson. What great work. Well, it didn't do well, so it just sank quietly. Nobody blamed me. But it was really a lot of fun. And it was fun for me to do. And the consequence of doing those 4 issues, which again, 10 people read. But I was walking down the hallway at Marvel one day, and Archie Goodwin was coming by. He was at Marvel then. And he stopped me in the hall, and he told me he'd really enjoyed the Galactus I'd written. well, that's like a little like getting the Academy Award in comics, as far as I'm concerned. Is Archie Goodwin, you don't get any better than the approval from Archie. So, I mean, one of the best writers, editors, and cartoonists comic books ever had, period. So he told me that he had a movie he was supposed to write the adaptation of for Marvel. John Buscema was penciling it or laying it out, and I think Klaus Janson was doing the finishes on it. He was supposed to do it. Archie, if anything, was always later than I was on his deadlines. So he said, "Would you want to write it?" I said, "Yeah, sure." When you're young, you're completely fearless. Okay, sure, no problem. It turned out to be something called Raiders of the Lost Ark, which, nobody ever heard of at the time. And so I had a script. John had a bunch of photo reference. So that went well. And then after that, I went ahead and did a graphic novel, a creator-owned graphic novel based on my old art school project, Star Slammers. I did the graphic novel next, which I wrote and drew. And then somewhere toward the end of that, Mark Grunwald, who was the editor of the book, offered me Thor to write and draw. Now, Mark was a friend of mine. You hang out at the office. Back in those days, comics was as much a social set as it was an industry. I don't know about now because, well, of course, now in the pandemic, nobody's in the office. Everybody's working from home. But even before that, with FedEx and the internet, you can live anywhere and do comic books, of any kind of comic books. And the effect of that, I think, although I'm not sure, in the old days, you would take your pages physically and go into the office. That meant that I knew all editors, even the ones I didn't work for, stop by, hang out, shoot the breeze. You'd see a lot of other freelancers. One of my earliest memories in comics is going up to DC where I was working with Archie. It was before that, well, a little with Archie at the time, but really in the early days. And Bernie Wrightson came in. Probably Chaykin was there, but Chaykin and I became really good friends. But all these guys, Bernie, Howard, other guys. And Bernie came in with pages from, I think, Swamp Thing 4. And there's a interior splash page, this great shot of a werewolf, a full figure shot of a werewolf and a head. Now, the guy's head who's being astonished it's so far down in the panel. I mean, it works great, but the guy must have been standing in a hole, or maybe he was in the basement looking at a hole in the floor. I mean, I'm looking at it going, where is this guy again in this drawing? But it didn't matter. It was just a reaction shot. And the werewolf was fabulous. And a lot of zipatone, a lot of tone work on it. And it was really, Bernie set the bar for the rest of us, way, way up here somewhere. So you looked at it and you went, oh, crap. You'd have to go home and work harder. And that was one of the exciting things about being in New York, in comics at the time, is that you had to live in the area. I mean, some of the older professionals, John Buscema lived out on Long Island. John Severn lived in Colorado, I believe. Some of the other guys Sal Buscema lived down in Virginia. A lot of guys lived in different places. The older guys, established guys, lived elsewhere. And at that time, if you were given a book to draw, that was pretty much it, as long as the editor remained the editor of the book. You had guys who did 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years on a book. Not so true now. Now we're all hopping around like crazy, trying to get juice those sales this month by getting somebody to be on the book for 3 issues. I don't know that that's a great business model, but I'm not a business guy, just a guy drawing comics. So I could come in, you could see work other guys were doing. I remember I told this elsewhere. I remember being in the DC offices one day. I don't know if Howard was with me or not. We were both big Alex Toth fans. And Alex Alex was in California. He sent in a job called Burma Skies that Archie, I think, had written. And the job came in, and we were all drooling over it. We were holding the originals and looking at them and trying not to drool on the artwork. And it was just, I can't describe how inspiring it was to be able to do that at the time. Weezy and I have had the discussion more than once that we sort of feel the time we came through mainstream comics in the 70s and 80s was just the best time to be coming through. Because you saw all this stuff. You could see work everybody was doing. There were some really good comics coming out. Early 80s at Marvel, mid 80s at Marvel was great. And it was very inspiring in that we tried to piggyback off the other guy to get better and better. And to see that work, talk to those guys. When I was doing Thor, I came up with a story in which Balder has to go talk to Loki. Didn't want to, but Odin sends him off on a mission. And in the story, this is a spoiler alert for anybody here who hasn't read a 37-year-old comic book. Balder goes and Loki makes fun of him and rides him so hard, and Balder's been through a lot in the comic I've written, that finally Balder loses it and he beheads Loki. Just takes the sword, goes right through him, through his neck, and then runs screaming out of Loki's castle. And we cut back, and there's Loki's body, just standing there with the head lying on the ground. And then Loki bends over and feels around and finds the head and picks the head up and puts it back on again, because Loki is a sorcerer, and sorcerers have tricks. And he just did this to get Balder's goat. Thought it was hilarious, hysterically funny. I like the scene a lot. I'm really delighted by it. But it is partly there because of Chris Claremont. Because I was in the office one day. Chris was there. We were shooting the breeze. Chris always told us his stories, so I told him some of mine. And I was talking about this, and my original idea had been for Balder to shove Loki down, grab his sword, and just drive the sword straight down. And we see afterwards, you cut this here, that what he's done is he's just about taken off Loki's ear, but he hasn't really decapitated him. And I think Chris said, oh, I thought he was going to cut his head off. And I started thinking about that. I said, and he could do it. Loki could have his head taken off and it wouldn't make any difference. Or at least I could write it so it wouldn't make any difference. So I really owe that to Chris. I don't know that it was a serious thought. It was what Chris thought I was going to do. And I thought, I am going to do that. So that kind of benefit of going into the office, seeing your fellow professionals, also getting to meet guys like Joe Kubert and Stan. I met Jack briefly, but at a convention. He was already in California by then, Jack Kirby. I met Ditko a couple of times. Didn't say more than a couple of words. I got to shake Steve Ditko's hand. I'm sure a lot of the younger guys who live all over the place go to cons, see people, go out and get drunk, hang out, have a good time. But there was a kind of I don't know how to describe it. It's like being fertilized. Every time you walked into the office, you just got more stuff and saw more work and saw what people were doing and talked to people, and had some idea of what was going on in the industry. Now I have no idea, but as long as the check clears, I'm okay.
So we were talking about when you started Thor, and the way you experimented also with the character. What was the editor's reaction when you decided to transform Thor into a frog?
A frog? Everybody asks that question. Mark was totally cool with it. When Mark gave me the book, although I was probably Ralph by then, Mark only edited the book for a year and a half, then it went over to Ralph Macchio. When Mark gave me the book, he gave me a sheet or two of typewriting, back we had typewriters, of possible ideas for Thor. Now, I wasn't supposed to do any of them. It wasn't like he was saying, okay, here's my list of ideas, you will do these. That wasn't what he was doing. What he was trying to do, and did do, was he wanted to show me that anything I wanted to do was fair game. Not unlike Battlestar Galactica, Thor wasn't doing very well when I took over the book. Whether it was on the verge of cancellation or not, I don't know. I've heard that story. I don't know if that's true. But it wasn't doing very well. Again, a great book to start writing and drawing, because if it sank without a trace, nobody would blame me. And if I did well, they'd say, wow, Simonson, what a genius. So it was a good place to be. But he had several ideas, none of which I remember, and I can't find the piece of paper. I don't know if I kept it or gave it back to him. I would give a nickel to have it now to be able to read through it. But there were ideas on there just to show me that anything was fair game. At a time in '83, one of the idea I remember was kill Thor, have somebody else pick up the hammer. Now, that would not be so unusual. that wouldn't be an unusual idea in 2021. But in 1983, it would have been a revolutionary idea. I mean, the Thor frog story, nobody said boo. Mostly, I used to run in those comics in Thor, I wrote all the letter columns. Mostly the letters are favorable. It's like when you get online, people can be very cranky about your stuff. Really crabby. Oh, this really sucks. This is terrible. Whoever told Simonson he could draw, blah, 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 blah. And whatever happened to that guy, Simonson, stuff like that. And whereas on the web, you could find out in 3 seconds if you felt like it. But in person, at conventions, or in letters, mostly people are complimentary. People don't mostly come up to you and say, hey, your stuff sucks. I'm not inviting anybody to do it. I just want
That's an internet thing. It's an
internet thing. That's exactly right.
Very.
So, and for one thing, I think part of it is that the internet leans in that direction, because if you compliment somebody, nobody comes back and says anything. Whereas if you start a flame war, 1 million people jump in. So that the positive reinforcement for creating negative stuff is to create more negative stuff.
Yes.
In any case, the letters were almost all positive. The Thor frog story was about half and half. It was about half positive, and the other half was mostly, it wasn't really negative, but it was mostly, gee, is this, I don't really understand this story. Is this supposed to be funny? Or is this, I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to get. It was just that. It was like, I'm puzzled by this story. So I got a lot of that. I got a few negative letters, but not, no more than usual. But I did get a lot of ambivalent mail, which was unusual, which is why I remembered it. And what's funny to me now is that now, 35, 36, 37 years later, after my Thor work, the stories I hear most about are Beta Ray Bill, sometimes the last Viking story, the death of the executioner, and the Thor frog.
Yeah.
And when I hear about it at conventions, the Thor frog story, it's never people walking up and saying, what did that story mean? It's people going, I love that story. So all the people that loved it come up to me at conventions now and tell me how much they loved it. So it gets good feedback. And I don't know that this was really one inspiration. The inspiration for that story was probably Carl Barks. I write notes to myself on my computer when I'm doing a regular comic. Some of the notes will be long, almost complete plots. Some will be just a quick idea. Loki gets caught in a mix master, whatever it is, something stupid. But I had a note that said, tip of the hat to Carl Barks when I was doing Thor. I'd like to do something to tip my hat to Carl Barks. And I don't remember how I made that connection, but somewhere in my storylines, when I got to the point where that Thor frog is, I thought, wow, I could do something right here. Initially, of course, I thought about doing a duck, changing Thor into a duck. But the thing about ducks is there's already Donald Duck elsewhere. There's Howard the Duck at Marvel. There's Daffy Duck.
Yeah.
And I thought, too many ducks. There are already a bunch of ducks. And also, in fairy tales, like the Grimm's fairy tales, a lot of folk stories, when the handsome prince or the hero gets turned into an animal, it's often a frog.
Yeah.
So that seemed to be the logical choice. And I don't know if this played a part in it at the time. I don't remember anymore. There was a wonderful Donald Duck story in Walt Disney Comics and Stories about the greatest hero who ever visited Duckburg. And it's a frog. So named Catapult.
Was there any character that you would have liked to work in the Marvel Universe and didn't have the chance to?
Yeah, two, I think. I'd like to have done Iron Man. I was a big Iron Man fan back in the Gene Colan, Jack Abel days and the Tales of Suspense. Loved that stuff. That's why there's a Titanium Man story in Thor. This guy got to draw Titanium Man. But on the other hand, David Michelinie and Bob Layton did such a great job with it. Would have been a hard act to follow. So maybe not. But I always loved Iron Man. It would have been fun to do an Iron Man, some kind of an Iron Man thing. I did include him in one of the Fantastic Fours for an episode or two, an issue or two. So I got to write him and draw him. And I wrote an Iron Man 2020. Well, it's like already past 2020 for Bob Wyacek to draw. And they're a different character, but it was still fun. And the other character I would love to have done and I don't know if I ever actually drew him anywhere, was Doctor Strange. I loved Ditko's Doctor Strange. Partly I loved the visual system of magic, the graphic magic that Ditko invented to show what Strangeness the other magical characters in that strip were doing. And it was completely readable. You didn't have to have Stan's dialogue. Look, it's the Crimson Bands of Sidorak. You didn't have to say that stuff. You could tell a guy was being blasted or shields were coming apart as the bolt got down to him. It was very graphic and very clear, and I loved it. So I would like to have taken a crack at that and maybe try to pick up on Steve's magic system and carried it somewhere. I don't even know where. I have no idea. Without doing it, I would have no idea. But to draw that magic system and advance it in some direction would have been a lot of fun. And I really enjoyed it. Even though you want to do stuff that hasn't been done too much before, I'd probably have brought back the Dread Dormammu and done him somewhere in there just so I could draw him. But that's a character I regret not, there's nowhere I would go back and stick it in right here. What can you do? Can't do everything. But that's a character I would love to have done.
Many fans would love to see your take on it, and there's still time. Maybe.
Well, there is.
Maybe Marvel.
Finish Ragnarök, I'll go back and talk to Marvel.
Historically, we tend to look to the 80s as the decade where there was a shift, a decisive moment of a shift to a broader audience, acceptance of comic books as a mature art form. What are your views surrounding this? Is this really a thing? Is it true? Is it marketing? Is it myth?
I think the writing maybe became more sophisticated. I think what Frank was doing in Daredevil lifted Daredevil beyond what it had been before, which was certainly, when I was reading comics in the 60s, even the early 70s, Daredevil seemed more like a second or third string Marvel book. That was true of the X-Men, actually, before Len started, then Chris got a hold of it. And then it became the Marvel franchise for a decade. So, and the stories became more complex, characters became more complex. Frank combined that with some really interesting graphic storytelling. He was a brilliant storyteller visually. And he really went to town on that book and then on later stuff as well. So that was coming in the 80s. Whether it became, had an option of becoming more adult right then, whatever that might mean. Here in America, that mostly means more sex. I don't know everywhere else, I'm not sure. But as a sort of more grown-up concerns, I don't know if mainstream comics made much of a jump in that direction. Maybe some, but I think some of the creators who cut their teeth in mainstream comics went on to do stuff that was more adult. And again, I mean that in a very broad sense. Howard Chaykin comes to mind, but Howard did both stuff that was sex and stuff that was very thoughtful, that moved out beyond anywhere mainstream comics was going to go. So there were guys like that. I'm sort of more mainstream comics. I mean, Ragnarök is grimmer than the stuff I did, but there's nothing in there I don't think I couldn't have put out in a mainstream comic if I could interest anybody. So I don't know. I think that's maybe what I do. And I do like doing stuff. Maybe it's my Karl Barks influence without having to think about it, is that I like doing work for a general audience. I want audiences. It's nice. I'd like adults to be able to read it and enjoy it, but I wouldn't mind having kids read it as well. And so I don't purposely guide my stories in that direction exactly, but it's maybe what I do naturally. And I think that's the stuff I enjoy. I enjoyed reading and I enjoy drawing. So that's kind of where I've stayed. And I haven't done anything as complicated in its own way as Manhunter was a million years ago. We were basically cramming 20-page stories into 8 pages of comics. So I was doing 10, 15, 20 panel pages back in those days. And most of them read. I mean, part of my interest is the graphics mixed with the storytelling. So, for example, when I did, that's where my interests lie. I did a couple of books with Michael Moorcock. One of them was called Michael Moorcock's Multiverse, done for DC back in the mid-90s. And it springs out of Michael's multiverse, out of the books he's written, all the books he's written. There were 3 different stories by 3 different artists. Mike wrote all of them. I was doing one about a character called the Rose and a bunch of other characters that were mixed in. And Mike's work, his novels, same way, incredibly visual. And so when I got the script, honestly, you could have printed the script and skipped the art. It was just such fabulous stuff to read. I think they're going to print this. They'll print the script one day and they'll say, "Boy, Simonson really screwed this stuff up," because I really had to kind of compress a lot of stuff to make everything fit. But it was so wild, and there was a visual quality of Mike's writing. I can't describe it. It works for me. I don't know if it worked for everybody, but the looniest layouts I've ever done are on that book. I did some nutty layout stuff that I would never do elsewhere, inspired by what Mike was handing me to draw. But then there are other books like Thor, when I did Thor for Marvel. And Ragnarök is not so different. I mean, in this regard, the myth for me is looking backwards into a past, to a mythic past. And as a result, I'm not so interested in being graphically daring on that work. I want the stuff to be very straightforward. I want it to have, not to feel like old comics necessarily, because I went back far enough to the 40s. I was doing tiny figures and full figures and no close-ups and other things. But I do want it to feel like kind of classic comics in that regard. When I did the Fantastic Four, I finally was able to get my own Xerox machine. I did a lot of copy work, a lot of op art stuff. I wasn't in Jim Steranko's league, but I did some goofy layout stuff in there. I did a time fight with Dr. Doom that I'm really still delighted by, where you have to jump around the comic and read it. You have to read it twice in order to understand what's going on. And that one, I'm still proud of that because I kind of feel that was something nobody else had done in comics. I'm not sure anybody else wants to, and I don't know that anybody else ever will, but it really felt like I'd gone somewhere with comic books that they had not gone before, graphically. And I was delighted by that. I did some other stuff in the FF where I took the graphics beyond other books I've done. But I want the graphics in the story to be dictated by or to be inspired by the story itself.
What are your plans in the immediate future?
Well, literally right now, I'm penciling and inking 2 issues of X Factor. Wheezy wrote the book many years ago. I drew it for 2 years for her. Other people drew it as well. I did 2 years with her. And she was hired by Marvel to come back and write a new 2-part story that fit into her old continuity. I love working with Wheezy. We haven't worked together as much as I would like, but we work together in every context. She's been my editor. We've been co-writers. I've drawn stuff that she's written. When that's done, I'll go back to Ragnarök. I'm writing the next story arc right now. My problem at the moment is I have too many ideas for it. I'm going to have to trim them down some in order to get into a 6-issue story arc. I may eventually do 2 6-issue story arcs to get the whole story told. I'm not sure yet. I got a long way to go on that. I have a million ideas. A lot of them are very finished, but they don't all mesh very well. So I have to figure out what I can jettison and what I can use. And then I really expect, as long as I can do it, I'll expect to do Ragnarök till I finish the story. I do have an ending in mind, several story arcs down the road. But I think I have a pretty good ending for it. So I would like to get all the intermediate stuff out of the way so I can write and draw that ending.